everybody. My name is Linda Carter. I am going to be your trainer for the next 2 hours. Give you a little bit about myself. I have been in the industry now for a little over 8 years, and I've worked as a study coordinator in research in investigator-initiated trials. I've worked as a CRA in a CRO, where I've had the pleasure of working with many mid to large-size pharmaceutical companies and phase 2 to phase 3 clinical trials. I've also had some experience working with biomedical devices. I worked with a high-risk device for a while with a startup company, and most recently worked with a very large vaccine company, Novartis Vaccines and Diagnostics, as a clinical trial manager. And in my various roles within these companies, source documentation is always a challenge, not only to ensure that you are developing them appropriately, but also sufficiently. And we're going to take a look at that as we go through our presentation today. So just a little bit about me, but how about you? I'd just like to get a feel for the individuals that are out there. So if you're representing a sponsor group, or if you're working at a sponsor group now, give me a green check. If you're working with a CRO, give me a raised hand icon. If you're an actual research site where you're conducting research, let me see a smiley face. If you're one of the other categories, give me a red X. Just like to get a feel and let everybody else get a feel for who's out there. Your perspectives in these different fields is really important and valuable to the other members of our participant group today. So as we go along, I'd be appreciative to hear what your experiences are in these different areas. So it looks like most of our audience here is with the sponsor group. I see a couple of independent individuals out there. Oh, we do have a research site as well. Welcome. Well, that's good. I always like to get a mixed group because, as you'll see when we're going along, just about with any particular industry, your perspective is different depending on the role that you're filling. And when we talk about source documentation, each of these stakeholders have an important part to play when it comes to source documentation. For our learning objectives for our course today, we want you to be able to define source documents, identify regulatory authorities' required characteristics of source data, analyze source document worksheets, that love-hate relationship, and discuss the case report form as a source data, and then evaluate best practices. Periodically during the presentation, I'm going to ask you for your feedback by either asking you to type in your response in the chat box or selecting one of those icons that we just did. I'd also appreciate if you provide your experience in any one of the areas that we're going to be discussing today, or ask questions either by typing them or raising your hand, and I will unmute you to hear your question. Now, I know we do have a large group today, so if I'm not able to get to everybody's question, I will provide you with a response in the electronic format through email. Regulatory authorities are always updating their expectation during their investigations to a risk-based approach. And those are the areas, when we talk about risk-based approach, those are those areas that are deemed within a protocol that have the greatest amount of risk for error. And so some of the current approaches to inspections also include looking at the 5 biggest areas where investigators tend to go wrong. And the first one, falsification. And that's when there's a deliberate or intentional decision to deceive or to create incorrect documents. The second area is oversight. This is a really big area for investigative sites, and this is an area where source documentation is not just for supporting the case report forms, but it's also the documents that demonstrate the investigator's oversight, such as regular meetings or communications with their clinical staff or training records. Those are the types of records that are also extremely important when we talk about documentation, source documentation at clinical sites. The other areas where clinical sites or investigators tend to go wrong might be communication breakdown. And when we talk about communication breakdown, that can be between the sponsor and the investigator or between the investigator and the IRB. There's also record keeping and documentation problems, as well as a failure to understand the elements of data quality and integrity. So quality source documentation demonstrates the greatest integrity when they meet those standards that we refer to as ALCOA, and that's the attributable, legible, contemporaneous, original, and accurate. And we're going to look at that a little more as we go along. So a lack of adequate or accurate source documentation has really been noted as a common deficiency in inspection findings in clinical investigators, and we're going to look at some warning letters that show that. And that directly impacts, whenever you have an inadequate or inaccurate source documentation, then that directly impacts data integrity, and that can lead to an application integrity policy, and that's something that comes from the FDA, which is a policy that states that the FDA can initiate if they determine that information that's coming from a clinical site is not supporting the information that's coming from the sponsor. And this policy can actually put a hold on clinical research for a study and all studies by the sponsor at that particular site, which we know would not be a good thing. Evidence of inadequate or inaccurate source documentation is also seen in a lot of warning letters, and we're going to take a look at a few of those.